I want to thank the North Carolina Council of Women for inviting me here today. I'd also like to thank Kevin Daniels, who's a good friend of mine, that invited me to come out. And I have to acknowledge Holly and her story. Such a powerful story. And when I think about history, and I think about the importance of Frederick Douglass, he was born a slave. And his importance was that he escaped from slavery, and then he wasn't just satisfied with his own freedom. He reached back to help those that were still enslaved. And he spoke out against that injustice. And Holly, a survivor of human trafficking today, to speak out, there's nobody that is more qualified to speak out against the kinds of injustices that you survived. So I thank you very much for sharing your story. As I was introduced, I think I heard Ms. Wilkins say that I'm the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass and the great-great-grandson of Booker T. Washington. That's a whole lot of greats, isn't it? I must be great. You know, every time I tell people what my relationship is to both Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, not only is it a mouthful trying to spit out all of those greats, but it sometimes makes me feel very far removed. And you may be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine what my connection is to Douglass and Washington. It's like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with all of those zeros. But just by a show of hands, how many of you know or knew a grandparent? Just about everybody. How about a great-grandparent? Well, that's how close I feel to both Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. Because you see, my great-grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 103 years old. She actually met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, she lived to be 95. And she was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy and sitting on my great-grandmother Fanny Douglass's lap, and she would tell me what it was like to know, as she would call him the man with the great big white hair. And I remember sitting on my Aunt Portia's lap, and she would tell me first-hand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And when I stopped to think that hands that actually touched the great Frederick Douglass, and hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine, in a sense, I can say, even with all of those greats, I stand just one person away from history. We're not that far removed from this history of slavery. And I've had the honor and privilege over the past 6 years that we've been doing this work to speak to more than 60,000 middle school and high school students. And I think sometimes you guys tend to think that, you know, slavery happened so long ago, and you look at historical figures like Frederick Douglass, and you don't really think about them as being living people that did so much. And so what I hope to do this morning is to inspire you with their stories. Because I'm going to talk about two men that were born slaves. They were born as the most horrific conditions that a human being could be subjected to, but yet through the power of education. Now for Washington, he was able to go to school because he was freed when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and he was 9 years old. But Frederick Douglass never spent one day of his life in a classroom. That's because it was illegal to teach a slave to read and write. So he was a self-taught scholar. He had to teach himself how to read and write, give himself his own education. And in fact, later in life, people would ask him, where did you go to school? Where did you get your education from? And he would respond by saying, my degree is written on my back. So I'm going to talk to you about his story. I'm going to talk to you about Washington. And I will always start with the foundation of history. Because of my unique connection to history, everything that we do as an organization to share this information that human trafficking still exists in our world today, everything we do is based on the foundation of history. So I always think that's the best place for me to start. Now the question that I always get, and I had the opportunity to sit with some students this morning when I first got here, and everybody has the same question. They always want to know, they'll say, so you're related to Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington? Well, what do you do? And they always follow that up with, and it better be good. And the other question that I always get is, so Douglass and Washington weren't related to each other, so how is it that you're related to both of them? Is anybody wondering that? Okay, well, we're going to start and I'll show you my Douglas Washington family tree. So here you see Frederick Douglass. He was born in 1818 and he passed away in 1895. He had 5 children. I descend through his youngest son, Charles, who had a son whose name was Joseph, who had a son whose name was Frederick Douglass III, and that is my grandfather. On the Washington side, Booker T. Washington was born in 1856, passed away in 1915. He had 3 children. I told you about my Aunt Portia, but I descend through his oldest son, Booker T. Washington II, who had a daughter whose name was Nettie Hancock Washington. That's my grandmother. Now, my grandparents met in 1941 at Tuskegee Normal School and Institute, which is the school that Booker T. Washington founded in 1881. My grandparents were rushing across campus and they literally bumped into the other person. Didn't know that they descended from an historic family. They fell in love at first sight and they wound up getting married 3 months later. I guess it was meant to be. And then when my mom was born, Nettie Washington Douglass, she united the bloodlines of the family. She was an only child, so I am the first male to unite the bloodlines. Here's a photograph of my grandparents on their wedding day. Doesn't my grandmother look like a movie star? She was beautiful. And to her right is my grandfather, Frederick Douglass III, and on her left is Booker T. Washington III. That's her brother. So the significance of this picture is you have Frederick Douglass III shaking hands with Booker T. Washington III, and thus the 2 families are officially united. There's a man with the great big white hair, and my great-great-grandmother, Anna Murray Douglass. Now, I mentioned that they had 5 children, but you only see 4 pictured here. That's because their youngest daughter, Annie, died when she was 10 years old, and we don't have a photograph of her, but that is my great-great-grandfather, Charles, there. This is my favorite photograph that I'm going to show you this morning, and you see Frederick Douglass with my great-grandfather, Joseph. Frederick Douglass had 21 grandchildren, and this is the only grandchild that he was ever photographed with. So we like to say that my great-grandfather was the favorite grandchild. Now I'm showing you these photographs because I want you to see how we're not that far removed, and through the photographs make the connection back to Douglass and Washington. So in this photograph you see my great-grandfather again as an older man. That's my my Fanny Douglass, my great-grandmother that I told you about. That's my grandfather, Frederick Douglass III, and his sister, Blanche. Now, on the Washington side, this is my great-great-grandmother, Olivia, and these are the boys. I descend through Booker T. Washington II there. And then there's a picture of the family. This is my Aunt Portia as a little girl. Now, we're really proud of something that happened just this past June. And that was that Frederick Douglass went from slave cabin to U.S. Capitol. And there was a statue that was dedicated in Emancipation Hall in the Capitol Visitor Center. And it was a wonderful event. There were more than 600 people that showed up. And there were politicians from both sides of the aisle that came together and spoke so glowingly about this American hero. And it was such an honor for our family to be able to witness him taking his rightful place after all of these years and all of the work and everything that he meant for this country. Frederick Douglass was born, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. He was born on the eastern shore of Maryland to a black woman who was a slave and to a white man, and it was presumed that his father was his master. He never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was 8 years old. He used to sleep head first in an old corn sack on a cold, damp floor because that was the only way that he could try and keep warm on those cold nights. He only saw his mother on 4 occasions his whole life, and that's because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. So in order for her to see her son, she would have to work in the cotton fields picking cotton from sun up to sundown, and then she would walk 12 miles in the middle of the night and spend just a few precious moments with her son. He was about a year old at the time, until he would fall asleep, and then she would walk 12 miles back so that she could be back on the plantation by the time the sun came up, because if she wasn't, she was most likely going to endure a brutal beating. That's what the slave masters did. They separated families. They separated children from mothers. Brothers and sisters were torn apart. Grandparents and grandkids were torn apart. He didn't know his brothers. He didn't know his sisters. He didn't know his father was. He didn't even have that much time with his mother. But he was raised by his grandmother until he was about 6 years old. His grandmother's job on the plantation was to raise the slave children until they were old enough to begin their life as a slave, to begin manual labor, and that was at 6 years old. So when he was 6, his grandmother said, "We're going to go on a long journey." And that journey was a 20-mile walk to the main plantation where she would drop him off, and the only person that ever showed him love in his life, he would now not see ever again. So he was born and raised as a boy without anybody around him to show him love. But what he did have when he was 9 years old was divine providence in his favor, as he called it. And that was, he was chosen from among all of the slave children on the plantation to go and be the house servant for his master's brother, Hugh in Baltimore. Now, this is a really important point, and I want you to listen to it because there's a lesson here. Had he stayed on the plantation on the eastern shore of Maryland, he was not likely going to be in an environment where he could learn to read and write. He was going to be in a big city now. But what happened was when he got there, his slave mistress had never had slaves before. And she didn't know that it was illegal to teach a slave how to read and write. So she began to teach him his ABCs. But when her husband found out about it, when his master found out about it, he forbade it. Now listen to this. His master said, "You cannot teach a slave to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." Did you all hear that message? Well, he had a profound moment, and it shows you what a brilliant child he was, because he heard that message too, and he understood that if his master didn't want him to have something so badly, that he was going to do everything in his power to gain it. And he understood that knowledge is power, and it would one day be his key to freedom. That is a lesson for today. Knowledge is power. And I know you hear it all the time from your parents and your teachers, your relatives, that you need to go to school, you need to continue your education. But it's true. Just like Frederick Douglass, once he had that knowledge, he might not have been physically free from the chains that bound him, but he was mentally free, and it was something that could never be taken away from him. And that's the same thing for you guys. It's something that will never be taken away from you once you gain it. Now, one of the ways that he went about teaching himself to read and write was he would trade bread for reading lessons. Now you see there pigs eating out of a pig straw. He talked about later in life when he wrote his first autobiography that he was so hungry as a slave child. He never had enough food, and he always had this pit of hunger in his stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, the overseer would take cornmeal mush, throw it into a pig's trough, and all of the slave children would crawl on their hands and knees as fast as they could to try to eat what little food was in there, to eat like pigs, to eat like animals, because that's what he was considered. He was property. He was owned by somebody else. He did not get treated any better than the horses, the pigs, the sheep, the cattle. And in some cases, he was treating worse. So if we jump back to this other slide, what does that say about the value of education and knowledge, that he would trade something that was so important to him, food, for reading lessons? It shows you how important it was to him. Now, what his master said happened. He became unfit. He became unruly. You could not tell him what to do. So he was sent to a slave breaker by the name of Edward Covey. And Covey would whoop him every single day. He'd whip him so bad that the welts on his back wouldn't have a chance to heal. And after 6 months of enduring these brutal beatings, he had finally had enough, and he decided to fight back and strike his own blow for his own liberation. And he and Covey had an epic 2-hour battle in which Douglass finally defeated him. Now, he knew again that at that point that he was not physically free from slavery, but he was mentally free because he had struck his own blow for liberation, his own liberation, and nobody could tell him what to do after that. He would go on to become the most important abolitionist that this country had seen, and as Ms. Wilkins said in the introduction, was an advisor to presidents, particularly Abraham Lincoln, and he was largely responsible for convincing Lincoln to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing 4 million slaves, the last of them in 1865. Now, Booker T. Washington was also born a slave, and as I mentioned, he benefited from the work of Douglass and the abolitionists in the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and he was free at 9 years old. He wanted to go to school so badly that he worked in the salt and coal mines in West Virginia at night. He would work long hours because he just wanted to save enough money to go to school. Now, in the interest of time, I'm fast-forwarding through a lot of this, but I want you to understand their importance so that when I talk about human trafficking, you're going to understand how all of this ties together. So he entered Hampton Institute in Virginia when he was just 16 years old. He would go on to graduate, and in 1881, at the age of 25 years old, he was asked to come down to Tuskegee, Alabama to start a school. And when he got down there, he expected to find an old schoolhouse or a church or some place where he could start teaching his lessons. But when he got there, there was nothing but dirt. So he had to start with the basics, and he would recruit the students. Now, if you think about it, there were 4 million African Americans that were freed when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. Most of them did not have an education, they did not have land, homes, jobs. So Washington understood that you needed to start at the basics. And in some cases, that education meant teaching the students hygiene, how to brush their teeth, how to tie their shoes. He would also teach them how to make their own bricks so that they could build their own school. And Tuskegee is still there today. It's a university that's educated millions of students throughout the years. But the most important thing that Washington did was he taught the students how to do something. He gave them a trade. He would teach them something that they could do so that they could have a stake in the nation's growing economy. But rather than demanding that the white race just change their ways, Booker T. Washington showed freed African Americans how they could change themselves, how they could overcome obstacles, develop strength of character, and rise by their own efforts to honorable positions of respect, but most importantly, self-esteem. Washington was a leader who brought stability in a time of transition from enslavement to freedom, and it may be said that he is the one person that bridged the gap between the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Movement. Now, I have always known that I descended from these great men, but I never celebrated it. I never embraced it. Can you imagine growing up and your ancestors are on money, stamps, bridges are named for them, schools, libraries. Everywhere I turned, I was in the long, vast shadow of my ancestors. I told you about the happy love story of how my grandparents came together, but there's also a tragic side to the story, and that is my grandfather was a brilliant man. He was the namesake of one of this country's greatest heroes. He always walked around with this weight of expectation on his shoulders of trying to be great like Frederick Douglass. And when my grandmother was 3 months pregnant with my mom, that weight of expectation became too much for him to carry, and he committed suicide. So my mother was raised without a father. She never had that influence in her life. And then when I came along and I had this dual lineage, my ancestors, my grandparents and my great-grandparents went in the complete opposite direction, and they weren't going to force anything on me. So I could have cared less about this lineage. And I'm sometimes embarrassed to sit up in front of a group and admit that I didn't want anything to do with this. And that was until Providence called in my life, and a friend handed me that National Geographic magazine that you see there. It's called 21st Century Slaves. And I looked at the headline, and I reacted the way I think most people do the first time they hear about the existence of human trafficking and modern-day slavery. And I thought slavery had ended with the work of Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists and the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. But as I started to research this issue, I have 2 teenage daughters who at the time were 12 and 9 years old. And when I found that there were girls that were my daughter's ages and even younger that were forced to be sex slaves in the brothels of Southeast Asia and service 35, 40 men a day. And I found that the average age in this country that girls are forced into prostitution is 13 years old. And I remember walking into my girls' rooms, having this information, and I couldn't look them in the eyes. I couldn't look them in the eyes and just walk away and not do something about this. And it was at that moment that I understood that I had this platform that my ancestors had built through struggle and through sacrifice. And I knew that I could leverage the historical significance of my ancestry to do something about this issue. Millions are enslaved around the world today, and we heard from Holly about sex trafficking in the United States, but we also have labor trafficking. You see young kids in Southeast Asia in the sun making bricks all day. We have slavery in agriculture, in Brazil mining charcoal. Slavery exists everywhere around the world, and there are slaves living in conditions today as horrific as the conditions that my ancestors endured. Most are female, and 50% are children. So we started the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives with the idea that we would go about educating the public where education should start, and that's with you young people. We believed that you could take the message of abolition to the internet, the technology that you all possess today. In the 19th century, the abolitionists used the communication tools that they had at their disposal. They published newspapers, they wrote books, they gave speeches, they passed out leaflets and pamphlets. You all have the greatest communication tool known to man in the palm of your hand. And the way that you're communicating on social media platforms and through text messaging, do you realize you can reach more people through the stroke of a key than Frederick Douglass could have reached his whole publishing career publishing the North Star newspaper? So we introduced a curriculum called History, Human Rights, and the Power of One. It's in New York City public schools right now, and we're taking it across the country, and we would love to see it implemented here in North Carolina. We start with the history, everything that I've been talking about today, then we transition into this human rights issue and that slavery still exists, and then the power of one is activating students and communities. The students work on projects that are all around raising awareness, and in many parts of the country, in school districts, high school seniors have to have a certain amount of volunteer hours in their community or service before they can graduate. So there's a service component attached to this so that you all can go out and really affect change. Our next project is Globalize 13. It's around to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the 13th Amendment. We're going to globalize the spirit of the 13th Amendment and talk about slavery in the supply chain, in the clothes that you wear, in the technology that you buy, in the chocolate that you eat. A lot of times there's slavery in the supply chain. You guys are the next generation of leaders. You are the ones that are going to help us solve this issue. You're going to use your passion, your talent, and your intellect to make sure that the world understands that this exists, because you are the next generation of great leaders. Now I'm going to close. History lives in each of us. History just doesn't live in me because I descend from two people that you've heard of and that are famous. But history lives in each and every one of you. And I guarantee that if you go back and you were to research your own family tree, you would find great heroes and sheroes that made a difference. You will find people that sacrificed so much, may have even given up their own lives just for the freedoms that we enjoy in this country today. Just so that some of us have the opportunity to sit in a classroom and get an education. History lives in each of us, but the future depends on how we carry that forth. Because we are the sons and daughters. We are the grandsons and granddaughters. Some of us are the products of slavery. This country is the product of slavery. This country is also the product of the abolition of slavery. From Frederick Douglass, we learned that we have a right to be free. And from Booker T. Washington, we learned how to make our way in the world as free citizens. And from Martin Luther King Jr., we learned that as free citizens, we have the same rights as all citizens. When I was growing up, the challenges faced by great men like Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington were apparent to me because it just so happens their blood runs through my veins. But the fact is, all of us, we live far from the cotton fields. And we're worried more today about our favorite sports team winning a ball game than we are about the threat of being beaten by our overseers. We live in modern times, and the echoes of slavery are hard to hear from where we stand. But if we all listen close enough, we'll hear cries and not echoes from the slaves of today. And when we listen close enough, that's when change will happen. This is Frederick Douglass's home. It's a home where he spent the last 17 years of his life. It's in Washington, D.C. And I was born in Washington. And as a little boy, we used to go on field trips to this home. And I remember walking through it and looking in his library, and I would just be amazed by all of the books that he had. And then if you walk up the stairs and down the hallway is his bedroom. And you know how when you go into a museum, they always have a velvet rope that blocks off the room so you can't get in and touch anything? Well, this is a view from the hall looking back in, and there's a rope there. Now, I spoke there a couple of years ago, and this young girl raised her hand, and she said, "Mr. Morris, what must it be like to walk in the shoes of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington?" And I thought, that's a deep question. And it reminded me of my time going to this home. And if you look in the bedroom, on his bed is his nightshirt. And next to his bed, on a chair, is his hat. And on the floor is a pair of his shoes. And when she asked that question, I thought about all the times that I visited that house. And as a little boy, I always wanted to sneak past that rope to try those shoes on. Well, this day that you see here, we had an opportunity because the site manager said, we're going to go on a special VIP tour. And so she took me with all of the students, there were about 25 of us, and we walked up to the room. She took down the rope for the first time in my life, and I got to walk in. And there were a lot of us in there, and it's not a big room, so we were crammed together, shoulder to shoulder, like sardines. And when the group photographer was ready to take the picture, he started placing people, and he said, you go here, you go here, you go here. And when he got to me, do you know where he put me? Right next to the shoes. And I looked down, and I said, there they are. After all of these years, all I would have to do is just slip out of my shoes, and I could slide right in Frederick Douglass's shoes, and nobody would ever know. And I'd be standing there taking pictures. I'm in Frederick Douglass's shoes, smiling. But I never did. I know. I never tried those shoes on because I knew that they wouldn't fit. Those shoes are too big for any of us to fit into. But what I realized at that moment was that I can take the shoes that I've got, and you all can take the shoes that you've got, and we can lead the way to a brighter future. We can lead the way to a better tomorrow. And each and every one of us can make the difference in the lives of those around us. And just like Frederick Douglass and just like Booker T. Washington, you all can go on to affect change in the world around you. With that, thank you very much for listening.